the funny thing is what is happening at that molecular environment in a way is an indication of what's happening at the local environment, if you will, right? So if you smoke, that has a particular epigenetic profile, which interestingly is passed on to your children.
Welcome back to another episode of the Peak Performance Life podcast. Today, I am very excited to be speaking with the DNA guy himself, Dr. Jeremy Koenig. He is a visionary beacon in the genomics arena. He has a passionate quest into the depths of DNA, being known as a DNA guy. He masterfully marries his personal adversity and triumphs, from redemption in a boxing ring to a meteoric rises on the track, with his groundbreaking strides in precision medicine and projects like Athletigen. The fusion not only positions him as a luminary in genomic research, but also a profound voice for human potential, resilience, and the future of individualized medicine. I'm very excited to be talking about this topic here of DNA, and we have an expert. He's going to be talking about all the different ways that people can utilize the information from their DNA to basically live a peak performance life. So, Dr. Koenig, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's an honor to be here, Tailor. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, the honor is ours. And would love to, let's jump right into, how did you get interested in DNA?
The truth is, my mom was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. I still remember the day she came home. I was about 14 it's about 14. And, she said, I have this progressive disease called multiple sclerosis. Here is its progression. That is, general paralysis, all kinds of degeneration associated with it, eventually leading her to be wheelchair bound. But I still remember when she came home, she said, don't worry, it's not genetic. And, I was like, what she was trying to say is, don't worry, you won't get sick. This is a me thing. It's not an us thing. And, I didn't really know one thing or to the other about anything DNA, I think, at that time. And so I think that was really where I, really came into the, online, I guess you'd say, to really consider this thing genetics in this way. And so that was my first real encounter with the idea of, genes could affect your life. Then there was another moment where this was now later in my kind of late adolescence, as in high school. And I just remember us doing a section on recombinant DNA as part of one of our homework assignments. And just the way that molecular biology worked, like the fact that you could, clone a fragment of DNA, like something like a piece of human DNA, put it into a bacterium and have it express insulin was just amazing to me. And, I was the only student who stayed up all night to figure out how the heck that actually worked. And I wasn't a great high school student. In fact, I had a bit of a checkered past. I dropped out for a bit, and for many reasons, mostly related to downstream issues in the home with my with my mom, and MS being being a mental health disease. So that led to challenges with us kids. But anyway, I did really get back into an interest in biology again, influenced by my mother, and thinking, hey, there must be some way to better understand this, and and lead to the improvement of people's health through understanding our DNA, and and educating people about it. So there was the disease angle, but then there was also the human performance side of things as well. So all throughout university, I was pursuing this kind of formal education in molecular biology, biochemistry. I went on to do my PhD in it, but the whole time I was, competing as an athlete also. And so I was always looking for ways to kind of bend that knowledge into, precision performance on the track. And, it turns out the better you understand your fundamental biology, the more likely you're going to be able to apply that to first principles of human performance or precision performance. So I've always kind of been walking on the side of human health and performance, and to be honest, there's also like a bit of a philosophical twist as well. My PhD supervisor being very philosophical. He's his name is Dr. Ford Doolittle. He's known for deconstructing Darwin's tree of life, let's say, and so that sounds real fancy. But at its essence, what he taught me was the mobile nature of DNA, jumping genes, if you will. Everybody listening is probably much more familiar about this than they think they are now, especially when you start to consider things like mRNA vaccines and, the idea that, these things are, mobile genetic elements potentially integrating into our DNA. In fact, it's true. The human genome is loaded with, kind of dead viral DNA remnants from our past, from our ancestors. But of course we're human, but we have this viral DNA in us, right? So really, like philosophically, it does beg the question, like who are we really? How are we made? And then this whole idea of information transmission intergenerationally, DNA being the vector for that. So, imagine where we are today with understanding our human DNA. Imagine everything that I just talked about with recombinant DNA and AI, and imagine what we might be in the future. So I try to give you a flavor there of all the different ways I think about DNA, but, really to come back to the question at its essence, it was really just, a kid who didn't know anything about genetics, who was concerned about his mom, who took an interest in it. So that's how the story began.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's interesting. So didn't recently they do something, because this is obviously it's fascinating. Maybe we're jumping forward a little bit and then we'll come back, but it's really fascinating about how potentially editing DNA in the future, right? And haven't they already started that with like sickle cell or something? Was there something that they did with that? Tell us about that.
Yeah. So, I believe there are, clinical trials underway. Essentially, yeah. So the gene editing technology, CRISPR-Cas9, that you're referring to is, again, it's the viral molecular biological tool to actually go in and through recombination methods, just basically change out genes. In fact, there was a case of this, I want to say close to it. I don't know if it's almost a decade ago now, where experiments were done on these twin girls in China, actually, where I think it was the receptor of the T cell receptor was changed out using CRISPR-Cas9 with the version of the T cell receptor that would make one immune to HIV, and that was not approved. I believe the scientist went to jail for that. But anyway, nevertheless, now here we are getting to a space and time where, gene editing is, has potential therapeutic applications for, something like red blood cell formation. And I think this is available in really, I'm not super close to the particulars, but I've read enough about it to know that I think therapeutically it's possible. And I think the intervention is, it's so few and far between that like the treatment is millions of dollars. So it's not cost effective yet. But you could imagine it becoming cost effective in the near future. That's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I can imagine 50 years from now, 100 years from now, it'd be like, man, can you believe those people had those genetic, predispositions and they just left it in there and they didn't even know how to change it or snip it out or whatever the case may be. It's going to be fascinating once we have that capability and the cost is reasonable for the regular person to do it. Even still, even in like in vitro situation now, right? Like you can choose if you want a boy, I heard you could even choose like eye color and things like that. It's pretty wild.
Yeah. I don't know if you remember, there was a movie, I want to say it's in maybe the early to mid 90s, called Gattaca. with Ethan Hawke. Man, it's exactly about that futuristic technology. Coming to a point where, the better we understand the genome, I think the more liberties we might take in terms of, quote unquote, optimizing a phenotype. Now, of course, it's really a slippery slope, right? There's the removal of disease. Okay, you can justify that, and then you might look at like athletes. Oh, the removal of injury vulnerabilities. You're like, okay, but then maybe do you get to like superhuman intelligence? Is there like what are the genes for IQ? Do we start messing around with that? I think it's a challenge to once you start to get into calling things, good genes. Like disease genes are, it's pretty, apparent, like the negative effects of sickle cell. On the other hand, heterozygous for sickle cell makes you resistant to malaria, right? So the good genes, bad genes, is, it's been going on for a time. And what we got to be really careful of is this whole notion of eugenics and engineering this superhuman race. And because, the worst thing you could do is engineer a race of humans that basically all look the same. And that would actually be the pinnacle of the most vulnerable population, because they would be so similar. And, natural selection and evolution, the tenets of the survival of any species is it was diversity to some, unknown future stress, right? Which today, those might be some hitchhiker genes that, well, they're not a help to us, but in the future they may be. So yeah, it's hard to resist, looking into our crystal balls, and making, super people, but yeah, I mean, there's going to be all kinds of unintended consequences with that.
Yeah, it's pretty wild to think about, right? Yeah, for all 6'4", perfect genetically, muscular, jacked, super intelligent, smart, high IQ people. But yeah, there's downsides to that too, right? It's easily we're more vulnerable if we're all the same. Yeah, that's very, very interesting. Well, let's bring it back to today. So with what we have today, right? That's the future. I love to think about that stuff. We could geek out about that forever. But right now, I know you've worked with a lot of athletes. I know you work with high-level entrepreneurs, CEOs, things like that.
Yeah.
What's the use case that you're seeing there? Like you said, people might be more vulnerable to injuries. Is that something that can be seen genetically? Cardiovascular, that's something that can be seen genetically, and then you can make modifications based on that?
Yeah. So, the athlete use case, it is very practicable. I'm glad you brought us back. We got very futurist there. But when I think about, it was the group in Phoenix, Arizona, then called the World Athletic Center, today called Alta's World. We studied, hundreds of those athletes. I mean, overall athleticism, we looked at tens of thousands of athletes. And, one of the things that, I saw was emerge was, I think, a pretty simple heuristic that coaches could use to discern the insights from all these diverse single nucleotide polymorphisms, these SNPs in our DNA. And so, broadly speaking, I saw them fall into three categories. That again apply to peak performance. So the first, so three buckets. Number one is injury vulnerability. Number two was training response, and then number three was let's just call it metabolic fitness, or avoiding burnout, and that's really like your nutrigenomics. So, I mean, the injury vulnerability, that's kind of a no-brainer, right? Like if you see that you have two triple jump athletes and one, carries specific genetic markers that have a high correlation to Achilles tendon rupture, you're probably not going to train those athletes the same way, or if you start to, hear of, one athlete presenting symptoms that are, typical of a, let's say pre-symptomatic of an Achilles tendon rupture, you're going to take it a little more seriously, versus if you just didn't know at all. So you can, as a coach, start to look at, the surfaces that you train on, emphasizing, technique, integrating more eccentric loading of the tendon, and then looking at things like intensity, density, volume, duration of training, right? And so you really get to, what I would call a minimum effective dose of training, which kind of speaks in opposition to, what we were told previously. Let's say in the kind of let's say from the 70s to, I don't know, even 2000s, early 2000s, no pain, no gain, right? And kind of that drill sergeant mentality, suck it up, buttercup, and yes, maybe sometimes, but actually not all the time. So, you start to see the benefits of coaches being more like gardeners instead of drill sergeants. So, the first thing is like recognizing that there literally are structural differences between humans, and some are more vulnerable than others. We all have a breaking point, and some is earlier. So injury prevention was, a huge benefit, for athletes understanding their DNA. Then the next is like training response. So training response, you can look at, if we just speak in terms of, let's just say energy systems, right? Your speed power athlete, like your sprinters, your VO2 max athletes, like your 400 meter runners, 800 meter runners. And then maybe your more, endurance athletes, 1500 meter runners, marathon runners. Now, of course, there's all kinds of other aspects of our, physiology and structural integrity in between that, in terms of how quickly you develop muscle, how, your bone density status adapts more readily, or your tendon and ligaments, again, their structural integrity. So it's how do all those things come in terms of your response to different kinds of stresses, because that's what training is, by the way, is a strategic stress, right? If you want to increase the athlete's, let's call it lactate tolerance, there's, threshold training sessions that you do that are specifically geared to increase, the VO2 max of an athlete. And, the interesting thing is that's actually studied very well from like a polygenetic perspective with VO2 max genes. Is you can have athletes adapt to, let's just say like a high intensity training program at twice the rates, so you can see the adaptations in, almost days, compared to some athletes that might take weeks and months. You might see other athletes that, don't have the sprint gene. And so, you very rarely do you see somebody line up in the 100 meter final that doesn't have a sprint gene. That's not to say it's impossible. I actually know, one Canadian gal that didn't have a sprint gene, and she raced in the 200 meters at the Olympics. And I think there was also documentation of a Spanish hurdler who didn't have a sprint gene, but they're few and far between. And then of course there's your, endurance athletes, your oxygen carrying capacity in your red blood cells, your ability to respond at high altitude training. So you start to hear about all those different ways, physiologically, anatomically, that an athlete can respond to different training. And then you start to think about a use case. You start to think about, well, what about a decathlete, right? Where the goal is to maximize the number of points. And there's any number of ways that a decathlete might do that. Now, well, what if you knew your DNA beforehand? Well, you get to save yourself probably years of trial and error and figuring out what does and what doesn't work. And it's not necessarily about trying to maximize points across all events. It's trying to leverage up, key events and, really dominate on, 4 to 6, versus maximizing all. So, given that, time is a limiting factor, that's really what I think knowing your DNA helps you do, is choose more strategically and get there faster. And then in terms of the nutrition, there's just, that's just a whole, rabbit hole to go down to, in terms of looking at micronutrient, the predisposition to be deficient in different micronutrients. And you think about when you're stressing athletes at the extreme, you're going to see the effects of, malnutrition sooner. And so if you don't absorb vitamin B12 as well as, your training partner, and you're both distance athletes, maybe you're not making red blood cells as quickly, right? Vitamin C, interestingly, we actually saw athletes who didn't absorb vitamin C well tended to report with, higher degrees of soreness and pain, which is, interesting because vitamin C is really important for, helping you lay down new tissue, new collagen. Vitamin D response would, correlate with, enhanced muscle adaptation and testosterone levels. So really starting to look at an athlete's nutrigenomic profile and start to, customize their nutrition based on their unique biology, right? So you start to put those three things together in a way that the coaches can understand and help the athletes implement. Well, now you're training in the future. Now it's not one size fits all, it's one size fits one. So that's what I saw in, some of the early days work that we did with Athletigen.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I had no idea that there was a sprint gene and, genes that show people that they're more prone to injury. Now, is that just based on, I guess the way that you figure this out is you have enough of a data pool, you have enough people whose DNA is in the system, and then you can say, okay, this person is constantly, injuring a tendon or something like that. And then that's how they figured out, is that how they figured out which genes kind of have which kind of responses there?
Yeah, you effectively, it's the method is called genome-wide association studies. So typically, well, actually, I mean, originally they would have just been single gene studies, right? So geneticists would know enough about a gene and its involvement in, say, making meniscus tissue, right? And then they can sequence those genes, and then they can look at, two populations of people, those who have had a medial meniscal tear and those who have not had a medial meniscal tear. And so effectively what they would see is that people who had these medial meniscal tears would have more of this gene variant, and there'd be a specific RSID and SNP code associated with that. And then that becomes documented. And, of course, it's not causation, it's correlation. But, the fact that it's in a gene that is important for the expression of collagen. And, then you would do the downstream science and see that, the different tertiary structures and cross-linking of collagen is effective. And so you can, go from the inference to actual demonstration of the anatomical changes. But the discovery capability has just increased, exponentially. If you think about it, actually, even before sports genes, is really more kind of like breast cancer research. You've probably heard of BRCA1, BRCA2 genes. Well, we learned about that in large part because of the Mormon population in Salt Lake City, Utah, who kept really good, pedigrees, their family relatedness. And so when you have the genetic information with families plus these super healthy normal controls compared to disease states, the discoverability is orders of magnitude higher because you have these such great enriched data sets. Now, fast forward from that, we have these enhanced molecular tools. We have different ways to partition data now. So now we sequence the whole genome, and we can sequence millions of people, and we can do things that are called genome-wide association studies. And so now you can imagine, effectively any human trait that you're interested in. And if there's a genetic factor underlying it, you're going to find it in theory because of these more enhanced statistical models. And we're starting to see that with polygenetic risk scores in health research now, right? So it's no longer just a single gene or a single point mutation. It's multiple genes that go into an individual's elevated risk for cardiovascular disease or type 2 diabetes or Alzheimer's. And so that's really fascinating because when you start to think about each of us is, we all have, to a large extent, all disease is informed by our genetics, and it's not just genetics. It's also the environmental factor, right? So you go back to the beginning where mom said, don't worry, it's not genetic. It's like, well, it's not a single gene that says you have MS, but there's definitely something in the genetics about the immune system, your production or metabolism of vitamin D that exacerbates your autoimmune response. So the point is that you have all of these different potential risks, and you can imagine them as like, imagine all of your genetic risks as a mountain range, right? And there's like, let's just say there's 5,000 different mountains there. So like my range of mountains would look very different from yours, right? Just based on your DNA. And so when I know that, I can start to, put together a longevity plan based on addressing the highest risks first and preventing them from happening, right? So whereas your highest risk might be neurodegeneration, mine might be cardiovascular, right? So we start to prioritize, how it is we go about developing these long-term, care plans and prevention plans.
Very interesting. Yeah, I hadn't heard I mean, you hear about the popular ones like the Alzheimer gene, right? But I had no idea there were ones that were regarding injuries and things like that. So that's really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of cool stuff to, that's currently under study. There's like super sleepers. There's like families of people who only need like 4 to 6 hours of sleep. I mean, that's interesting because that's like a DNA influence. But then if you're not gifted with that, and you're thinking, wow, what could I do with an extra 4 hours every day if I didn't need sleep? And it's like, well, what is it that these genetic factors are facilitating, and can I manipulate the environment to get that same kind of outcome, right? So it's not necessarily like we have to jump to change the genes, but there's in the same way that we see this with athletes, you can get athletes that look totally different genetically, and in a race like something as homogeneous as the 100 meters, and you're going to train them like very differently. Like for example, some athletes respond really well to weights, and they're like that kind of push athlete, and there are others who are more reflexive and respond better to plyometrics, and they're more kind of that gazelle. But they run almost exactly the same time with different training approaches. So that's the thing that's really fascinating is trying to understand from the athlete's perspective, what's their goal, what are they starting with, and then how do we work with the puzzle pieces of genetics plus environment plus behavior, and then bring about the performance of a lifetime.
Nice. Amazing. Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit now for maybe non-athletes. There are a lot of people here who are successful business people, things of that nature, or just your regular average everyday person who wants to be healthier, doesn't want to get a disease, obviously. I've been hearing a lot about the methylation gene. Was it the MTHFR or something like that? Is that the methylation one? And there's been a lot of talk about that one recently, that, oh yeah, if you have this gene and whatever certain percentage of people, 40% or whatever the number was, I can't remember exactly, have this gene. And if they do, then they don't methylate vitamins and you have to take a methylated vitamin. Do you know much about that one? Because I know that's a really hot topic right now.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually had, oh gosh, what's his name? I had the author of book is called Dirty Genes on my podcast recently. And oh my gosh, that's terrible that I don't know his name. I have to get that. But I'll tell you, Dirty.
And shout out the name of your podcast while we're at it.
Oh yeah, thank you. My podcast is called the DNA of Things. Dr. Ben Lynch. That's cool. He wrote Dirty Genes, and we talked at length about DNA methylation and It's funny. I was going through, my family's DNA, right? So I was, it's really cool because, I've done the analysis looking at my wife's genetics, my genetics, and then I look at our daughter's genetics. And on the topic of, the MTHFR gene, I have so-called typical or, normal activity. So first, let's dive into what's the MTHFR gene? So it's a methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase, and it creates an enzyme that's critical for processing folate or B9. And that's essential for DNA production. It's essential for DNA methylation, for cell growth, for the breakdown of homocysteine. This is an amino acid that's linked to inflammation and disease. And so variants in the MTHFR gene can affect how efficiently the body metabolizes folate, impacting cardiovascular health, impacting mental health and well-being, and even pregnancy outcomes, right? And so my wife knew that about herself, like the MTHFR gene. She knows she had the slightly reduced variant, and so she supplemented accordingly with folate. So I have the version that's fine, and it it turns out that you have two copies of every gene, right? So Kristen would have had one that was good and one that was slightly reduced, and so heterozygote for the trait, and there wasn't a 100% chance that would have been 50% chance that would have been passed on to our daughter Brooke, but it turns out that Kristen did pass that slightly reduced enzymatic activity and capability to our daughter Brooke. So what does that mean for our family who wants to be healthy? So for me, no major impact on folate processing. So, okay, great. Maintain a, balanced diet rich in natural folate. That's easy for me. But as it relates to my wife, Kristen, and our daughter, Brooke, it's like, well, there's a potential for this, elevated homocysteine, this inflammatory marker, increased cardiovascular and mental health risks. So, for them, we're potentially a little more proactive with methylfolate supplementation, and just that much more diligent and vigilant with respect to like folate-rich foods. And so, we just talked about at the MTHFR gene. There's like literally, thousands of these like cool little snippets that if you make a commitment to learn a little bit about your DNA every day, you get to make these marginal gains that are based on your own unique biology. So not only is the benefit better health, you kind of get like a PhD in your own body, which is kind of cool. So, the idea that this is true for, how, the enzymatic activity requires, more folate, in order for its functionality to, kind of be, adjusted back to quote unquote normal. There's, all kinds of combinations of micronutrients that you put together and after consulting like a nutrigenomic profile that you can get from any number of different DNA companies. The one that I'm doing some consulting with right now is sequencing.com. So you get your whole genome sequenced. That's like 3 billion base pairs, and they have hundreds of these different gene reports where you can actually go in and get a sense of how might I top up my biology just using nutrition. And before, they used to be like these 100 pages of reports, and it'd be like, it's great because it's like a whole encyclopedia on you, but it's also daunting because it's a whole encyclopedia on you. But now, what you can do is with obviously these LLMs, with these language models, large language models, can now run AI and basically ask it to like read, interpret your report, give you the high points, but then also create a 1-week meal plan and a shopping list to how you might actually activate this. So you don't need a PhD in genetics anymore, but you do need to learn how to ask the right questions. So like, it seems to me like this whole AI movement, some people might, you see this in schools in particular, the kids aren't going to learn how to think critically and everybody's cheating now. And I think it's the opposite, because it actually forces you to ask the right questions,
Right.
which is kind of neat. And it's like, unless you're going to like sit down and really know what it is that you want. It's like when you make the 3 wishes to the genie, it always ends bad. It always ends badly because you didn't actually know what you want until you got it, until you received it. So, so yeah, I think the fact that anybody can get their genome sequenced now for like under $400, and it used to be $4 billion, and you can get the answer in like 4 seconds instead of 4 years, which is what a typical PhD takes. It's like, it's some really exciting times right now for people to get to know themselves in a way that they've never been able to do before.
Yeah, that's incredible. So you you work with and you like sequencing.com.
Yeah.
And then so you pay whatever it is, few $100, you get all of the, like every genetic marker you're getting there pretty much.
Yeah. So you pay $399, and I mean, it's a pretty extensive analysis. I mean, the first thing you get is like this analysis of all known pathogenic markers around, you get you're assessed for around 10,000 of these right now. Fortunately, I only have a handful of these that I need to watch out for. But once you get past that understanding, then you can get into more, kind of lifestyle genomics reports. And so they have a report marketplace of hundreds of different reports that are related to cognition or athletic training or skin health. And so basically you go in there with your goal and you choose the DNA analysis that's in line with your goal. And then from that, they actually have the AI built right in to the product so that you can have a conversation with your DNA reports, and you can create action plans within the software suite, which is pretty compelling.
That's pretty cool. So you don't need to talk to an actual coach about the results and have the coach walk you through and give you recommendations. Is that being done by AI now, I guess, essentially? Or
Well, I mean, I'll give you an example. So like when my daughter was born, she wasn't gaining weight. She was gaining weight at a concerning pace. And, so there were some specific genetic markers that we knew on her that, were concerning and required, more follow-up on. And so, when we're going into the pediatrician and, you're working on a health action plan, it's like, you're emotionally compromised. So, having a coach, having a clinician, a genetic counselor, kind of help you navigate the space when you're emotionally compromised. I don't think that's ever going to go away, right? Because I think that's one of the great things about humans is the great thing about life is the interpersonal experience, right? So I come to know myself by knowing you, and vice versa. And so I think a lot of the administrative, monotonous work that's a lot of burden, like I think that's I'm already seeing that being removed with AI. But it's like, once I get down to like, okay, the thing that requires some interpretation, I mean, having another human, I don't think that's going to go away. At least not in my life.
Right. And so would sequencing.com then also give you recommended supplements and things like that based on? So they would recommend supplements, or you could recommend a meal plan, nutrition plan. And so that's interesting. So are there people that genetically, I'm sure there are, but like, some people do amazing on a vegan diet and a lot of other people do amazing on a carnivore diet, right? Like, so do you think a lot of that comes down to genetics as well?
Here's my personal bias. I don't think anybody does amazing on vegan or carnivore. I mean, any kind of strict diet, I think I understand how when you go on a diet like that, you feel a change. And I've done them. I've tried them. And like you go vegan, it's like, wow, I feel super clean and clear for a time. But then I start to notice cognitive decline because I'm not getting enough B vitamins, let's say. You know, and then same thing. I go on a carnivore diet. I'm like, wow, same thing. Actually, I feel incredibly clean, um, but you know, it feels like my electrolyte balance is off. You know, so I think that how we respond to diets, like, yeah, there's absolutely genetic factors that underpin them, but depending on where, you know, your ancestors hail from, I think that has a huge impact, right? So, and the thing is too, is like with all of the, you know, you think 10,000 years ago, we were mostly isolated, right? And so we would be well suited, well adapted for our local environments. Um, you know, like the indigenous of the North would eat predominantly fish and do great on it. In fact, we're seeing a lot. That's true. A lot of hunter gatherer populations in general, exposed to the agricultural food practices, you know, are super vulnerable to like type 2 diabetes, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think there's definitely like there's bigger, you know, more noticeable consequences on basically response to sugar as a big one, but you know, also with fat and protein and then certainly with the micronutrients. But now that we're not, you know, we're not geographically isolated, our genomes are like they're cosmopolitan, you know, so there's been a lot of mixing. If you've done like your ancestry DNA or anything like that, you know, I don't know if you've done that, but I've seen that. I'm like, oh, okay, I've got some Northern European, Eastern European, South African, some Viking. And actually, when I look at the functional genes, you know, I would say that I eat like a Mediterranean. I have the structural integrity of a Southeast Asian, and I have the engine of a North African. So basically, I have like markers associated to those regions because of the mixing. So it makes for a really interesting conversation, doesn't it? Because you know how we tend to do with different diets is what we have adapted to, you know, over time. And so I think, you know, coming back to the point, you know, vegan versus carnivore, it's like those are extremes. And I mean, I guess, you know what, if you were one of those hunter-gatherer populations that were at the extremes of extreme carnivores, like I'm actually maybe would be better adapted for that. The vegan one, I just don't see in our evolutionary history where that was ever something we did.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think there's certainly times of like, you know, prolonged starvation from meat and meat sources, but you know, they're still bugs and yeah, alternative protein sources. So, but the short answer to your question is, yeah, DNA is going to affect, you know, any diet. I just be careful not to say, oh, I'm genetically perfect for vegan or genetically perfect for carnivore. It's yeah.
Yeah. Makes sense. Makes a lot of
Mm-hmm.
sense.
Mm-hmm.
So let's real quick before we wrap up, I do want to get your opinion on like epigenetics, right? So there's a big thing about epigenetics, and your genes are not your destiny, but
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
information, right? And that's
Yeah.
basically what you've done with the athletes and entrepreneurs you work with is you've taken the information from the DNA and then you help them to not make that their destiny if there's any ones that are not favorable, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the epigenetics is interesting, right? Because it's basically like the expression profiles, right? So just because you have a gene doesn't mean you express it, right? Like enzymatically now, I guess I'm talking. And, you know, you can actually measure things like methylation patterns, which is epigenetics is basically means like above the genome. And it means basically molecular control of the genome without actually changing the DNA in terms of the base code. It's changing the DNA in terms of access to transcribing the base code. And that's done with these compounds called like methyl groups, methylation added to the DNA at points that make it harder to express. Acetylation, conformational changes to like how our chromatin is packed. The cool thing is that like that's literally like a local or a molecular environment, right? If you can imagine it, you know, deep inside of each cell. And you know, the funny thing is what is happening at that molecular environment in a way is a is an indication of what's happening at the local environment, if you will, right? So if you smoke, that has a particular epigenetic profile, which interestingly is passed on to your children. Same thing if you exercise, right? And yeah, there's all of this really interesting work now being done around, biological clocks and aging, and looking at DNA methylation patterns to essentially calculate what your biological age. And so like the holy grail now is, okay, I want my chronological age to my biological age ratio to, or let's say it the other way, my biological age to my chronological age, I want that to always be decreasing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So if I'm 40, if I'm chronologically 40, I'd like to be biologically 20. So I'm one half is the score, right? So, and so, the way we measure that is again, there are different tests. I think True Diagnostics does some, I believe. There's a guy out there, I can't remember his name, who's, he's his goal is to like get his biological age down to like 18 or something. But there's a whole leaderboard of these people looking to look at their epigenetic profiles to, get into competition who can be younger, at least by this metric. So yeah, I think it's that's cause for optimism, as you say. It's like, well, even though I'm born with this set of genes, I can outsmart them. Right. And I do that by learning how my genes interact with my environment, and so choosing it appropriately. So again, if I have a family history of MS, although it's not strictly genetic, I can't quite measure it. If I spend more time closer to the equator, exposed to vitamin D, and I increase that in my diet, well, we know that lower vitamin D is also associated with increased incidence of MS. So, I'm making the environmental change there. I'm taking part in, healthy habits for my diet and exercise from a behavioral point of view. Taking great pains to prioritize, my positive social interactions as well to limit stress, and all of those things affect our those things in our environment, our behavior. They actually have an impact on our epigenetics, so to speak.
Right, exactly. And I think, that's the key point that I think a lot of people, it's important for them to understand that if you get this genetic test and it says you have the Alzheimer's gene, doesn't mean 100% that you're getting Alzheimer's. It's actually good information for you. And you might want to think about, okay, what's causing Alzheimer's? Is it inflammation? How can I lower inflammation? How can I eat a kind of low inflammatory diet, or whatever the case may be for that situation, right? So I think that's important for people to realize and understand.
100%.
Yeah. Well, Jeremy, this has been amazing. Where can people find you, learn more? And then I think you recommended sequencing.com. Yeah. Any other kind of like resources for people here?
Yeah, definitely check out sequencing.com. You'll learn everything you want to know about your DNA there. That's for sure. In terms of where people can find me, my podcast is The DNA of Things. Yeah, it's a nice lineup of, really forward-thinking people, creators. I'd love to have you on the show.
Absolutely.
At your convenience. Yeah, so that's The DNA of Things. And then in terms of my my handles, they're all at Dr. Jeremy Koenig. At Dr. Jeremy Koenig. So that's on X, Facebook, and Instagram. I haven't set up TikTok yet, but it will be that once I decide to set it up.
Amazing. Well, this has been really informative. Highly recommend people check out your podcast and get your gene sequenced for the information so that you can learn how to best utilize that information to live a peak performance life. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope we can do it again soon.
My pleasure. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, can you please leave us a rating or review and subscribe? I've realized that while we have actually increased our downloads a lot, we're actually getting a lot of downloads, which I'm really happy about. We actually have very few ratings. And I realized that I've never asked people really to rate much. So I'm asking you now if you could please rate and review and subscribe. And if you enjoyed the episode, please forward it along to anyone that you think will get value out of this. Also, if you haven't checked out our line of products at buypeakperformance.com, you get 20% off your first order. That's www.buypeakperformance.com. We have some incredible products, including our organic high-altitude coffee. If you don't know this, coffee is one of the most heavily sprayed with pesticides out of any crop. So it's really important that you drink organic coffee. We've gone above and beyond to source what we believe is the highest quality and healthiest organic coffee in the world. We're also famous for our organic green superfood powder. You can get 20% off of that as well at buypeakperformance.com. We also have an organic vegan and paleo plant protein. See, most of the vegan proteins out there are using brown rice protein, which is really not a good source of protein, and it's also a grain. And if you're paleo, you know that grains tend to cause inflammation in some cases for some people. And so we wanted to make one that was paleo friendly and vegan and organic. We made an amazing amino acid profile, so it's really one of the best plant proteins for muscle building. So you can check out Peak Performance Organic Plant Protein. You can find that on our website. Of course, all our products are on Amazon as well. So thanks again. And again, please, if you enjoyed the episode, please forward it along to someone who you feel can get value out of it. And please leave us a rating, review, and subscribe. Thank you.